I'd like to introduce our session moderator, Linda Toth, Associate in Climate and Sustainability at Arup, and she will introduce the panel when they come up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us today. Really excited to get into this topic with you all. Really important discussion on the critical intersection of decarbonization and resilience in the context of affordable housing. I'm going to start us off with just some quick intros from everybody so that you get to know us all and our backgrounds in this space. Really excited to be moderating with you today. I'm an associate at Arup on our climate and sustainability team. I don't work directly in the affordable housing space very often, so I'm really excited to keep growing this toolkit of climate solutions that are really important to be impactful in the work that we do. One of the roles that I have at Arup, I lead our internal initiatives within our Americas region, where we have this commitment of sustainable development is everything. A little overwhelming at times. We think about the volume of projects that we do, scale of projects that we do, but again, the toolkit needs to kind of be overflowing. So learning from all of these experts today on our panel, other panels that are happening, has been really great, and I'm excited to keep building that, right? I talk about handprint of projects when we work in the design industry. So how can we get better at the handprint that we have on projects out in the built environment? How do we make sure that outcomes are actually realized on the ground and not just talked about and discussed or put into a plan, but we can actually see it in the neighborhoods that we live and work. So with that, I'm going to pass it to the far end of my panel, and we're going to start with Marion McFadden, if you want to give us a little intro of yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's great to see so much interest in this work. It feels like there's more and more every year. I lead the Office of Community Planning and Development at HUD, which provides about $10 billion annually to communities across the country for a variety of affordable housing, community development, and homelessness prevention and services. That funds a lot of building, and so we are very much focused on how we can ensure we're funding and supporting the right kind of building across all of our programs, and then especially when we get billions and billions and billions of dollars for disaster recovery grants. I come to this work from the affordable housing space and from the lens of working with communities after disasters, after Hurricane Katrina and other disasters, finally asking the question, wait, are we doing enough to take care of the earth to try to prevent some of these disasters? And all within the context of serving the people of modest means, the people who need the most support from the government in order to benefit from affordable.
Great, thank you. Go right down the line. Calvin Gladney next with us.
I was told that I could go rogue on this intro, and there was nothing that I specifically had to talk about.
Correct.
So I'm going to kind of go rogue. I often will talk about, I worked at Bridge Housing, so one of the largest affordable housing developers in California. I see one of my favorite architects taking pictures. I'm a former real estate developer and consultant, blah, blah, blah. But I think one thing that might differentiate me and kind of why I'm really here and doing this work is I'm probably one of the few people that folks know that actually grew up in public housing. So I grew up in public housing in a small town in New York called Brooklyn. Not sure if you've heard of it. Also, my mom, during the time of Hurricane Sandy, lived in Coney Island. Yes, Coney Island is a neighborhood, and lived in public housing in Coney Island. And when Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy hit, she, at age 82, had to climb down 16 flights of stairs. And beyond that, as many of you probably saw in pictures, Coney Island was ravaged for years to come. There were literally piles of sand, no library, no banks, no ATMs for years. And so for me, this is personal. And I get the privilege and the pleasure of being the president and CEO of Smart Growth America. We take a kind of interdisciplinary approach to community revitalization. So we know that communities don't just have housing and land use problems. They also have transportation challenges, and they also have issues with economic mobility. And we believe those are inextricably intertwined. We have this theory called smart growth, try to talk about it later, where we try to apply that both as policy advocates, technical assistance providers, and hopefully thought leaders through signature reports.
Great. Last but not least, Pallavi, Mantha.
That was a hard to follow intro. But I'm Pallavi. I'm an associate and I co-lead the climate and sustainability team at Arup in New York. And I have been working in the affordable housing space and decarbonization and resilience. That is another intersection. I've been operating it more increasingly. And I work with the likes of NYSERDA, looking at resilient electrification in homes in disadvantaged communities. And then I've been working with Boston Housing Authority, and I've done like decades worth of work with New York Housing Authority, covering topics of sustainability, decarbonization, resilience, all of that. Increasingly, what I've learned in my work, through my work, is that decarbonization, resilience, and equity, you really can't meaningfully move on one of them without moving on the other two as well. So I'm here to learn and share what I've learned through my work, and learn from everyone here. So thank you for having me.
Great. I'm really excited to get into this. I do want to give a little bit of an intro, do some scene setting on what we mean by decarbonization and climate resilience. We're all starting on the same foot here. So as we're thinking about this, I want you to be thinking about decarbonization as we're referring to reduction of carbon emissions across various sectors of the economy, specific to existing buildings for most of the discussion that we're going to have today about affordable housing. It's our global response to the pressures of climate change, commitment to mitigate the adverse effects of greenhouse gases on our planets, and not really just from the environmental perspective, but the ethical and moral responsibility when we're thinking about these future generations that need to inherit the buildings that we're going to have. So then, juxtaposed with that, climate resilience is thinking long-term about our ability to adapt and withstand the impacts of our changing climate. Building communities and infrastructure need to be able to endure the rising temperatures that we're seeing more and more often, increased storms, flooding, other climate-related challenges depending on what locations you might be talking about, and how we anticipate what science is telling us the future is going to look like here. So now why does this really matter in the realm of affordable housing? A couple reasons. First, affordable housing is often situated in areas that are most prone to these climate-related risks. Low-income communities are disproportionately affected by extreme weather events, rising sea level, making them more vulnerable to displacement and housing insecurity overall. Decarbonizing these communities can reduce the emissions long-term that contribute to climate change, lessening these climate risks, and safeguarding affordable housing and affordability of safe home for everyone long-term. Second, energy costs can be substantial for renters. Decarbonization strategies and energy-efficient building retrofits, the use of renewable energy sources need to be intentionally paired together, thinking about utility costs for the renters at the same time. If we can reduce utility bills, there's other things that are really important that these people can spend their money on in a really impactful way. And the last one, thinking about the connection between decarbonization and climate resilience and affordable housing, isn't just about mitigating risks. It's also an opportunity for job creation and economic growth. These unprecedented investments that we're seeing for clean energy technologies provide good paying long-term jobs for community members in sustainable construction practices, climate resilient infrastructure, and really thinking about underserved communities and this pipeline that can be built off of apprenticeships and on-the-job training from doing these type of projects. So I'm going to ask everyone to step back and think about the term affordable housing a little bit. There's many different definitions for this. We're not siloing ourselves in our conversation about a specific definition here. There's income-based, there's government subsidized, workforce housing, low-income housing tax credit standards. All of that applies here and even more. So we're looking for this common ground, right, for pausing to understand the diversity of individuals that live in affordable housing are really the important factors here. These are single-parent families, multi-generational families, veterans, seniors on fixed incomes, people with differing cultural and ethnic backgrounds, maybe English not being their native language. as well as workers who are really critical for keeping the businesses and things that we love to do alive and well. Service industry, restaurants, non-9 to 5, Monday to Friday jobs. The number of renters with these cost burdens around their rent, their energy utility payments, water utility payments, is reaching an all-time high. The statistics are in from 2021. The number of people with a burden from their housing reached an all-time high in 2021, that threshold typically being more than 30% of your income. We're expecting those numbers to keep going up as we see the data coming out from 2022. Sharp increases in these bills, whether it's rent or utilities, from maybe a malfunctioning system in your home, unexpected medical bills, can really compromise whether people have a stable home that they can continue to live in. At work at Arup, my resilience colleagues start many of these conversations in the space with the following questions. What has to go right? What could go wrong? Who might be impacted? And what are the consequences of that? So I'd like to think about that framing. So we dive into details, talking a lot about many things at this intersection, so that we can think about how to prepare, protect, and improve housing affordability and readiness. So with that, we want to start off with the fun policy topic. So Marion, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about this really great space we're in with the federal policies that are out there, how you're hoping this is going to really push the market, how we've moved into a more proactive space. We're not as just responsive when the disaster hits, but trying to better prepare so that we don't have as much cleanup to do, hopefully, when the disaster does hit and everyone is in a safer position.
Okay, I'll be brief, but let me start by saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So the federal government has made available a ton of money around dealing with climate change, electrification, decarbonization, et cetera, but most of it didn't go to HUD. So most of it is not exclusively for affordable housing. So at HUD, we've been working to support communities in identifying what are the other sources of funding that are out there. But we did get funding to support buildings that already have an ongoing relationship with HUD, like public housing or insured housing buildings. And there we have $800 million in grants and $4 billion in low interest loans to help modernize buildings and to make sure that they are getting on board. And the inherent point there is we need to provide capital to ensure that the upgrades that need to happen to modernize buildings, especially including electrification, is funded, right? We need to ensure that the costs of this are not passed on to people who are strapped, people who are overwhelmed already with their costs of providing for their families and dealing with things. When you look back over the pandemic, there was an infusion of supports that really made a difference in households' lives. And with that pulling away, we need to be careful about not doing things that are great for the planet, but really hard to absorb at the household level.
Great. And you already got into all those great stats for the incentives that are available out there in this space. So Calvin, I know we had some good conversations about thinking about how do we make sure everyone understands what's out there, how they apply for different incentives, what they're eligible for, and you have some great tools in this space, it sounds like.
Gotcha. Well, first I wanted to quote the great philosopher's Wu-Tang Clan. Cash rules everything around me. So the first step we've already accomplished, which is literally billions of dollars of unprecedented federal investment in the space. The challenge is we need to marry cash with knowledge of what to do with it, and actually how to access it in a way that will allow you to take your community vision and translate it into the outcomes that the money is seeking to get to. And it's that gap, that knowledge gap, that awareness gap, and frankly, a capacity gap at the community level, which we are trying to marry with the policy. So one example is we have a project right now, and it's called Community Connectors. And we're Smart Growth America, so you can Google all of this. But what we've done is a couple of things. We first created a portal with the idea that community members could go online, and the portal unpacks all of the acronyms, terminology, sources of funds, and Marion actually mentioned this. A lot of this money, most of this money did not go to HUD. So if you're a community, you're faced with 5 different federal agencies that have funding that sound the same. How many different agencies have used the term thriving communities recently as their source of funding? And so the idea of the portal is to give them a basic understanding of how to navigate the acronyms, the terminology, and what are even the resources that would apply to their vision and the outcomes they seek. Second, awareness is not enough. So this particular program provides technical assistance to communities so that a community could, at whatever phase they're in, right? So some communities need help with defining the vision that would allow them to get to adaptation and resilience. Some communities are like, we have the plan, we just don't have the money. And so there's a technical assistance approach that helps them understand how to apply, what kind of team you need to put together, what do you even say? And so I really think it's marrying this kind of unprecedented financial moment and the sort of appropriate policy with the capacity and tools for community members to know how to access it and then go after it.
Yep, that's super important. The resources are very different in all of our communities of where the knowledge base is. So I'm really excited to learn more about that tool so we can continue learning in that space. So again, the messaging here can never have enough of it, I think, in this space of how to do these projects, right? So messaging, not just what incentives are available, what policies are out there, but why these are important. Again, this coming back to the definition of affordable housing, thinking about people that live in affordable housing. Often the climate space is not their number one concern day to day in their lives until something happens that makes it a big concern. So messaging the benefits of proactiveness and wider community benefit. Curious, I think everybody probably has a point here of, the importance and how we can all kind of share the good news about why this is important and how everybody has something to gain on some spectrum here for the shared value that we can see outside of, if you're working as an architect in this space, outside of the property lines of your project that you're working on, pulling your head up a little bit, thinking about who are the surrounding neighbors, who are the surrounding community members, how can we do this a little bit better?
I can start us off from the household perspective, and maybe y'all can talk about the larger picture. From a household perspective, let's take the example of gas stoves. Like, replacing gas stoves with induction stoves basically is, there's several co-benefits and trade-offs, right? The co-benefits are basically is that, one, you're electrifying partially your home, and hopefully you'll electrify your heating and hot water as well down the line. But replacing gas stoves immediately offers a safety benefit. There have been several fires that started in New York City recently that came from gas equipment being turned on or being used improperly in homes. And so you're eliminating that fire risk, you're eliminating the air quality issues that also come with gas stoves. So there's an immediate benefit to installing induction stoves. But what happens, and what we're seeing a lot, is that there are behavioral change challenges to having induction stoves, because we were talking backstage, and Marion was pointing about how you need a whole set of new, different vessels that work with induction stoves. That who's going to pay for that? There's a bit of startup sort of funding that is required to make the conversion and then make sure that you're operating it with the right set of pans and pots. There's also, cooking is very personal to everybody. It's so deeply rooted in our culture, and cooking sometimes it's not just for cooking. It's about the show. It's about the community and all of that. And sometimes you might not get that feel from induction stove, right? So there's a few different perspectives about switching from gas to induction, but there are very clear benefits to it.
My wife is a chef, and when I dared suggest we move away from gas, it was like, are you kidding me? And I was like, wow, it starts at home, doesn't it? But anytime we're asking people to make a big change like that, it can become political really quickly. I actually love seeing the responses to the question on the board, people talking about increasing health and safety and well-being, because those are things that resonate with everyone. So I think part of our collective job is to tell the story of why this is important in a really kind of neutral way to help everyone see the benefits for themselves while they weigh it against the losses.
I have that same battle at home. My husband is a former chef also, so fighting the good fight starts at home. We'll get there.
In the interim, we make sure to run the fan.
Yes.
Can I take a little more macro as the non-chef on the panel, or chef-adjacent person on the panel? Because I do think, well, actually I have a question. How many people here work in the private sector? Show of hands, private sector. Mostly private sector. So to me, packed in this question is, why should someone in the private sector, morality aside, actually care about this? And I think it's a couple of things. One is insurance. Insurance companies are going to start taking into account, they already are, you've seen some of them move away from certain states on the residential side, but ultimately, in terms of financing the development or redevelopment of buildings, there's going to be a challenge with getting financing and insurance for buildings that are not built to be climate resilient, but also portfolios of property that are in harm's way. And so from a Machiavellian profit-oriented standpoint alone, you could say, if I don't do this, at some point I won't be able to do what I want to do, or the financing or the insurance costs will change in a way, or it just won't be possible. So that's one. I think two, at Smart Growth America, we're trying to create the type of mixed use, mixed income, transit-rich communities where people have access to jobs and amenities, just like many of us have. And if we're going to end up in a world where affordable housing isn't on an island, and that affordable housing community is right within your middle class or, God forbid, upper middle class or wealthy community, which it should be, by the way. Shout out to Ward 2, by the way. Anybody here from Ward 2? If we're going to really create those kind of mixed-use communities and do more missing middle housing, I see Daniel in the audience as well, then we know that it will be important for folks in affordable housing to live in a place that's resilient, to get these kind of household cost reductions, but also to live in places that are healthier. And if you do that for the people in affordable housing, and our communities are mixed income, mixed use communities, then that will inure not only to the benefit of the folks that live there, but the folks that live around them as well. And we should also just note that, and we saw this during COVID, that the folks that live in affordable housing are our workers. Most folks that live in affordable housing have a full-time job. And so the more that we can do things that reduce the household costs of workers who are in affordable housing, create a healthier environment, and frankly allow them to withstand what will be more often weather events that dislocate people, the more folks that live in affordable housing can withstand that financially, emotionally, and socially. They can stay at work, they can keep at work, their kid can stay in daycare, the better that will be, because in some ways they are the invisible infrastructure of our economy, which we learned during COVID.
I love that. Yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons learned in my career trajectory is I tell my team a lot, is it capital S or little s sustainability, right? How are we messaging this? And it doesn't need to be blasting in your face like we're doing this for sustainability. You got to understand the why. And so many times it's a safety factor, but really maybe it's safety from a climate event, right? So it's all connected to climate and sustainability at the end of the day, but you don't need to be pushing that message. You need to know your audience, know your clients, and meet them where they are at on this journey of understanding and prioritization of these common goals that we need to tackle. I think.
Ooh, can I
Yeah.
say something to
Yeah.
the architects in the room, by the way? So I see some hands. See, the architects, they're just self-identified. They're like, look, I'm an got to claim it.
We knew by their glasses already.
Ooh, low blow, low blow.
No, it was said with respect.
And I saw a couple architects take their glasses off. Just think about those buildings that you're designing and visualize what happens when the next 100-year flood occurs, which won't occur 100 years from now. Or these significant rain events where you get, a year's worth of rain in 3 days. Those buildings that you design, if you don't design them to be more resilient against those ongoing events, then those pictures of those disaster areas, again, this is Machiavellian in my point of view, but those buildings that you design that cannot withstand those, or the paint, or the brick, or the facades, all of those things you should think about from a design standpoint, even if you, small s, don't care about sustainability, but care about the aesthetic and visuals of the things that you build. Those things need to take into account what is going to happen. It isn't climate change, it's climate now. Mm-hmm. And the type of climate we live in and will be living in for the foreseeable future requires architects and designers to say, what can I do to make sure this aesthetic, this visual, this design that I've brought to life actually sustains?
Great. Let's keep building off of that. Real project examples here. Pallavi, I'd love to hear more about your kind of kit of standard solutions that are starting to form in this space, what that's looking like, what you've learned along the way.
Yeah, so when you think about decarbonization, like what good looks like from a decarbonization perspective, you think about weatherizing a home, maybe adding insulation, upgrading the windows, maybe you'll have the home electrification ready, or maybe you'll add heat pumps and electrify it, and then you'll add an induction stove. And then maybe you'll go one step further and add PV on your rooftop, right? So that's sort of like the standard solution set, whether it's an affordable home or not. But what we're trying to avoid is getting stuck in that box checking exercise of like, here, I've decarbonized this home. What we are suggesting is that, take a step back and think about a critical consideration that was missing in that standard kit of tool set. Who lives there? And what are the sensitivities? Is it a single parent with a young child? Is it someone who is mobility restricted? Is it someone who is reliant on medical devices? And where is their home? What hazards do they face now and in the future? And then above all, what happens when the power goes out, right? Like if you have a fully electrified home and the power goes out, how do they cope? What is their adaptive capacity? So we can't just think about, here, I've decarbonized this home, my job's done, I'm gonna go. No, we need to think about decarbonization and resilience as a combined approach to this. And what that means is that when you start thinking about adding insulation and upgrading windows, you're also thinking about increasing passive survivability for those residents. When you're thinking about the person who might be reliant on medical devices, you're also thinking about, we need to provide battery backup. And maybe we tie that battery backup to those PV panels on the rooftop. And so you start creating a system that doesn't fail at the first climatic event or the first stress or shock that comes around. So we need to kind of take that combined approach when we are designing, when we're retrofitting these homes. So that's kind of what, we've generally been seeing. I'd be curious to hear.
And if I could add to that, right, so all of the things that Pallavi's talking about, the loss of your medicine, the loss of the food in your fridge, right? These are really significant to people with the lowest incomes, and so it becomes extra important to make sure you have that community solar with battery backup or other opportunities to keep them online and operational. So that's one of the things we've been looking at, in addition to ensuring that we're really considering the new weather patterns of where people need to have air conditioning. If you think about the heat waves we saw a couple of years ago and hundreds of people dying, there's a new map of where we really need to be ensuring that we're prepared for extreme temperatures, both hot and then cold.
Definitely. I think that's critical, right? I think so much more living here in DC about what's going to happen in our summers in the future, when really, to Calvin's point, the precipitation events are probably equally as risky to us. But thinking, I guess we're a little bit East Coast based here on our panel here, but curious if anybody has thoughts about other risks or ways that you're thinking about other areas of the country, maybe Marion, some examples of projects not East Coast based and some lessons learned.
I mean, in a word, wildfire, or maybe that's 2 words, but we have seen so many devastating fires. If you look at the Maui fire and just go back to about 2017 with the first really bad California wildfire in a long time, we need to be ensuring that in these places where there's any risk of fire, that we're using better fire-resistant materials, landscaping processes, that we have escape routes, right? We all need to be looking at what the risk could mean in the face of disasters that happen so incredibly quickly, that it is all people can do to get away with their lives.
Part of the challenge here is that I think some of our focus is too narrow, because the resilience is not just in what you build, it's in where you build it. And if you think about some of the extreme weather events that we've had in the last couple of years, major hurricanes, one of the signature visuals on the news is a long line of cars stuck on the highway and everyone trying to get out of town. And so there's resilience in what you do in the streets. Have you created the kind of multi-modalities where folks have the options to bike, to scoot, to walk, and in their moment of the perfect storm or whatever kind of weather event that's happening, they're able to, quote, get out of town but not use a car. And so some of our resilience and some of the things we need to think about really needs to think not just about the building and what we build, but what we build around it, the infrastructure that we put there. Because if community is going to be resilient, we know that things are going to happen. And sometimes that's going to require them to leave the building, whether it's a gas stove or electric.
And also to get to the car or van
or
bus.
even get to the car.
There.
And so some of it needs to think about the infrastructure surrounding the buildings and how they get to and fro when these things happen.
Yeah, I think not just transportation infrastructure, right, but our utility infrastructure, right, and making that as safe as can be for preparing again for what the climate is showing us is going to keep happening in the future if we don't course correct. So I want to shift us a little bit, I think, and talk about the affordability perspective of these really ambitious goals of decarbonizing and preparing for climate at the same time. How do we actually do this?
Why gosh, why don't we let the federal government go first? So we're doing a bunch of policy rulemaking around the minimum energy standards for when there's new construction or substantial rehabilitation where HUD money is coming in and doing it or ensuring the loans that allow the building to happen. So taking what we've learned from these disaster impacted communities and what we understand where the technology needs to be and saying that matters everywhere. It really matters everywhere that we focus on these things in the context where we are providing those dollars or making sure that those dollars get there, not trying to do some sort of unfunded mandate situation with our rulemaking, but also looking and working on a roadmap, working with the Department of Energy for our portfolio of buildings so that we, for the first time, can actually get a baseline of the energy consumption, the cost, and what it's going to take to move forward and bring everything into the modern era. I would say also it takes money, right? So we talked about some of the big money we have. One of the the most overlooked components of affordable housing in this country is manufactured housing. I think affordable housing folks have had a real blind spot for many decades. I include myself in that. There have been advocates really talking about the extreme challenges that people are facing, particularly with pressure from sales as commercial investors are purchasing properties. So I was really thrilled when Congress gave us $225 million for a grant program and we're going to put those funds out later this year, which include ensuring climate resilience, making energy upgrades, replacing manufactured housing units to much higher standard than whatever they were built at in the 70s or later.
Do you want to remind folks about what you mean by manufactured housing? Because I would bet that we might have 12 different thoughts on what you actually mean.
Well, gosh, it's like you've been in the building with us discussing what manufactured housing means for the purpose of this program. It didn't come with a definition, so we'll put that out in a NOFO. But for now, think it was built in a factory somewhere and delivered to a site and then can be moved to another site. But in reality, it's very, very expensive to move a home. So if you have someone who was able to purchase a manufactured housing home, but didn't have enough money to buy their own land, they may be renting from in a community and then not actually have the money to move it after a disaster and something happens, or even in the face of rent hikes that are becoming necessary as insurance rates go up, right? This is a problem we're seeing all over the country, not just in Florida or the Gulf Coast anymore.
That's great. I've heard some rumblings of one of the biggest manufactured housing companies really being excited about the IRA incentives for net zero ready homes, and that they can actually claim the incentive, reduce the price that they then sell that to on the market, but also removing the stigma that comes with this term manufactured home, right? What a lot of people think of when you hear that phrase is, not the greatest picture that comes in your mind. So it's really exciting to me to hear, right, like that manufactured homes are soon going to become associated with net zero homes. Like that's a fantastic shift of what hopefully will come soon with these federal policies.
One thing I was going to say is we also need to tweak the policies, at least in their implementation. So you guys may be familiar with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, GGRF as folks talk about, which is, again, sort of another example of huge federal investment in the space. But a lot of the new funding is either by design or by default in what they say or not say will drive new development to utilize the funds. But we all know that the greenest building is an existing one. And so I think some of the policy needs to actually specify that existing buildings can access the funds. We've actually advocated for this point because right now it's sort of open-ended, and actually have strings attached that maybe has extra incentives to allow folks to tap into these funds to green an existing building, because those buildings, of which we have more than all the new developments combined, and they already exist in places where we know where the climate resilience challenges are. And then finally, it helps us fight against sprawl so that we're not in an environment where folks will continue to drive to qualify, particularly in this interest rate environment. And so we can build where there's already existing infrastructure, green the buildings that are already there in communities that already exist, and ultimately that would be better for climate change and better for resilience as well.
Except that we need so much more affordable housing in this country. We need at least 1.5 million units, maybe as many as 3 million units, seeing even some higher estimates. So we do need to ensure that building is happening, but how do we ensure that we do that in a way that doesn't create sprawl? Right, so that goes back to local zoning and decision making around supporting infill development, allowing modular and manufactured housing in places where it hasn't existed before. I think it takes a lot of solutions. And this is where it has been really fantastic to see states come to the table. Over the last 10 years, states, cities, and counties have started using their own dollars to create affordable housing at a scale we had never seen before. So just wanted to say that it really takes more than the federal government and the private sector. We also need those other layers of government to bring everything necessary to get the capital stack in place to get one person home.
Can I add one point on this? You mentioned zoning, my favorite word these days.
I can't believe I beat you to it.
Beat me to it. I've probably said out loud more often than not that zoning in some ways is the invisible infrastructure that dictates almost everything we do and can't do. And how many people here would consider themselves zoning experts? Oh, a good amount. If you care about climate, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and any other term you can use on that spectrum, you have to learn about zoning. And ultimately, because there will never be a federal zoning law, we need to create a movement on a state by state, county by county, locality by locality basis, where there's a set of principles on how we can change zoning so that we can get the supply of affordable housing that we need, but that we also allow private sector developers to do transit-oriented development and equitable transit-oriented development, because right now, in most places, it's actually illegal to do the type of mixed-use developments that we want, particularly around transit. And if it's not illegal, as private sector developers will tell you, it's so hard to do that it doesn't make sense. And even as architects, you know that oftentimes you're the one navigating the Byzantine set of rules that only an expediter knows. Why do we even have expediters? Because there's a set of rules and structures and discretionary moments, and it's the zoning, stupid. And to coin a phrase.
So, as you think about that, wherever you're working and living, a good question to ask is, hey, have you noticed HUD has grant funding available for updating zoning and for dealing with other issues? We got a one-time infusion of $85 million that we put out on the street in July. Applications are due October 30th. The communities that are applying, states, cities, counties, and metropolitan planning organizations have to seek public comment on their plans. So at least by sometime in October, they should be putting plans out. So now's the time to ask and say, have you seen that money? Are you thinking about that? Because it's resources that can help update zoning and other barriers to affordable housing, whatever they might be.
It's a very hot topic here in DC, as those of us living here with our HITE Act dictated by Congress is a little bit separate than I think what HUD can help us do here. But yeah, it's been really interesting also. Zoning can also impact decarbonization solutions.
Yep.
We at Arup have done studies here in DC about the embodied carbon limitations based on the HITE Act, right? Developers need to have a certain amount of leasable space within the zoning area. So if you want to do something like maybe mass timber, you need a little bit of more floor-to-floor height. You can't make the numbers pencil out because you lose a whole floor of rentable space within the height limitations. So something that's really impactful and has successful ways of being implemented, zoning immediately puts a limit on how creative and how climate forward we can be sometimes with our design solutions.
One last small point, just as a factoid. In larger metropolitan areas in the country, upwards of 75% of the landmass is zoned for single-family housing, which means a lot of the strategies that we're talking about to do at scale, you can't do because you're not gonna be able to put enough panels on enough single-family residences to make enough of an impact to do the things that we want to do in terms of our greenhouse gas emission goals and the like, or to decarbonize. And so that point alone, that we have too much single-family zone land around the country, that alone will stop most of the things that we want to incorporate, because we can't build the affordable housing at a multifamily scale or the missing middle housing, which might just be 4 units. But right now it says single family house, a certain lot size, a certain type of setbacks. And I should just say, because I want to say this out loud, this is all based on a race-based history, right? So all of this single-family zoning was built on inequitable outcomes to begin with. It was built to fight against black and brown people having opportunity and economic mobility like everybody else. That's the infrastructure in which we're working, and that's the history. So we need to undo it, not just because we want to do more in resilience and fight against the climate crisis, but also because it's the real way to advance racial equity. I just had to get that in there.
Totally agree. Great points. Pallavi, anything on this one? We kind of bounced around a lot, but just
Yeah.
on the affordability and solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, we need to break the chronic cycles of disinvestment. And for that, we need to start and solve for affordable housing first, because then you can then expand outward, and I bet it would work for everybody else. Because traditionally, we've seen investment go to where the money already is. Now that's the thing that we're trying to stop and adjust course to say, well, let's focus on affordable housing. Let's think about it together from a decarbonization and resilience perspective. And what that means from a practitioner's day-to-day job is that our modeling has become more sophisticated. Our decision-making has become more sophisticated because now we have to think about compounding risks and compounding sort of all the other burdens that these houses already have. And then designing solution sets that could potentially be incentivized and funded by policies that are in place and coming down the pike. And traditionally what we've seen is some policies might just say, here's money to install a heat pump. But when we start talking about, let's talk decarb and resiliency, we're talking about mitigation and adaptation in the same line, we need policies to kind of fund solutions that tackle both. And in some cases it has worked out. And some of with our work that we've done with our clients, we've been able to unlock funding for them from a resilience pool of bucket, where previously they were just prioritizing and looking for decarbonization. So it does open up opportunities, but it also means that our policies need to adjust the way we are actually solving for it on the ground.
Great. I'm going to come back to Pallavi again because I think there's another story that I want you to share a little bit about some of the work that Arup's been doing related to tools in this space. The one tool that our New York team has been involved in is a little bit more resilience first, but I'd love your perspective of how you take some of these tools that are being developed out there, and if it is an imperfect solution or not perfectly pairing up climate resilience and decarbonization, how do we massage these and make them fit for the right place that we're looking at, the right type of housing that we're looking at, the right people that are living there for whatever's going on in that community specifically, to kind of right size. We don't want to keep building more and more tools. We want to be able to use the tools that we have more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things there. One is, as I just said, like there's our toolkit has to become a lot more sophisticated because we're thinking about so many different layers of information. So one of the tools we've been working with is actually with HUD and Enterprise called the Property Assessment Tool, which is like in support of the Green and Resilient Property Program. And what this does is that it basically has come up with a decision tree against 19 different hazards that are in the FEMA database. And it starts with, if you identify a location where your home is that has, let's say, wildfire exposure and extreme heat exposure, it kind of talks you down to what are the building systems that need to be adapted, and what are the actions you should consider taking now, and what are the actions you should consider maybe perhaps a bit later. So, for example, if you're talking about extreme heat, only extreme heat, a solution might be green more of your outdoor spaces, add more plants, native plants, and then if you choose extreme heat and wildfires, the recommendation changes to pick plants that are wildfire resistant. So it's a very nuanced, it's a very small point, but that's the kind of thinking we need to bring into every aspect of the building system and think about the compounded risks. Because we've had wildfire smoke in New York and all of the East Coast from the smokes in Canada. That was not something that we were thinking about before, at least like I wasn't, until it happened. And we're like, oh, I can't open my windows now. And so, back engineering to say, what does that now mean for people living in these houses, and how do you then come up with a solution that works for wildfire smoke, but everything else as well?
Great. Calvin or Marion, anything in this space that you've seen as success stories that you'd like to add on? What's moving and shaking and...
Well, I mean, it's been great to see the interest of communities that haven't had terrible disasters learning from their neighbors, right? My mom used to say it's a sign of intelligence to learn from other people's mistakes. And we see a lot more communities coming forward and saying, what can we do? So actually, HUD is working in partnership with enterprise community partners with dozens of communities to help them understand what is resilience, how do they assess their needs, how do they create their plan of who they want to be in the face of these stresses, and then hopefully those communities, once they have that vision and have that story, are in an even better position to go out and fight for all the federal resources that are available or at the state level.
It's great. We need more of this. Proactive, proactive, proactive is great to hear for this. All right, I think we're doing good on time. We're about close to wrapping up. So I'm gonna bring us back to those framing questions I had in the beginning. What has to go right? What could go wrong? I know human psychology, we're all pretty good at thinking about the what ifs of what could go wrong and reasons to not do something. So I'd like each of the panelists to kind of close with a what has to go right moment from your perspective in this space.
Am I starting? Okay.
Sure.
I think I'm going to just repeat what I just shared earlier, which is we need to break the chronicle cycles of disinvestment and focus on solving this for affordable housing. At Arup, we also think about how electrification, decarbonization is a disruptor, and then going from there and solving for it. Because, like I said, if it works for the affordable housing community, it'll work for everybody else because they have the scale. So in New York, NYCHA is the largest landlord. So if a solution works for NYCHA, it'll work for everybody else. So there's a scale, there's several other factors that are going for affordable housing, and therefore let's channel our collective energies to solve it for affordable housing first.
The question is, what has to go right? I would say, in almost all these cases, irrespective of what the investment is, what the idea is, what the policy is, unless we get it right for Black and brown communities and lower income communities that have suffered from disinvestment for so long. And by the way, just a terminology point, we talk about disinvestment. These were actually investments. They were just investments in other communities. So the disinvestment part sort of leaves out the fact that not only was the inappropriate infrastructure put in certain neighborhoods or not maintained, but actually other communities received investment, received infrastructure, became resilient, which means we actually need to play offense and defense. So what has to go right is not only do we have to fight against inequity for these same communities, we actually need to put a thumb on the scale and have an equity-first mindset and say the first investments we need to make, the first folks that need to understand how to do these things now are the folks that we've historically left out of the equation.
All right, Marion, closing thoughts.
I said earlier my favorite thing to say on a panel is, I vigorously disagree, but I can't do it. I totally agree. I totally agree that we need to ensure that low-income people, that people of modest means, who are retired, people with disabilities, people of color who have had no access to the kinds of opportunities that the government was providing, and to this day have not had the opportunity to realize the wealth that was built over generations because of redlining and policy decisions about who could get access to mortgages. We need to ensure that everything we're doing is rooted in these communities. Later this week, I'm going up to New York City for the 10th anniversary of Rebuild by Design. That was an effort started by HUD 10 years ago after Hurricane Sandy that focused on community resilience around great community engagement. And I think that really is testament to the fact that the federal government has been coming to the table to try to encourage these conversations so that people living in public housing, people in low-income communities are at the front of the pack, not the back.
Great. Thank you all so much.